Thank you. Welcome to this informal meeting of 12-step fellowships welcome to this informal meeting for members of 12-step fellowships who are interested in recovery through the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is Alistair, I'm an alcoholic. To set the tone for the meeting, I will read an extract from the preface of the big book. Because this book has become the basic text for our society and has helped such large numbers of alcoholic men and women to recovery, there exists strong sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA program, the AA recovery program, has been left largely untouched in the course of revisions made for it for the second, third, and fourth editions. The section called The Doctor's Opinion has been kept intact, just as it was originally written in 1939 by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, our society's great medical benefactor. At tonight's workshop, we will start at the bottom of page 9, the paragraph beginning, "He had come to pass." And Tim will work through the text paragraph by paragraph, pausing for questions. When the time comes for questions, this can be done by the raised hand function in Zoom, or you can message me through the chat function and I will try to ask Tim directly. We will try and close around the hour mark, and with that, I will hand over to Tim.
Thank you. My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic. So this paragraph, bottom of 9, top of 10. Here come to pass his experience along if I cared to have it. I was shocked but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. So this is, I think, a recurring theme throughout the book. Without the admission of hopelessness, then the program is so objectionable, there's no way someone is going to actually get on with it. I've had the experience of starting to sponsor people, very keen, and then literally within 48 hours, people are backpedaling, saying, well, I'm not sure I've got the time, I'm busy at the moment. And it is a very threatening thing because I think the program threatens one's whole way of life and perception of the universe, and therefore identity. So that one's got to be in pretty serious, pretty dire straits. I think this is borne out by it's something called prospect theory about how risk averse people are, but whether people are likely to take risks on bets, for instance. And one of the learnings from that is that when people have got very little to lose because all the options are terrible, they're much more likely to take a risk with a very, very large payoff. And I think that's how this works. My sponsor was talking about once, many years ago, was talking about a line later on in the big book where he's talking about fearlessly facing the proposition that God was either everything or was nothing. And I said to him, well, why is it fearlessly? And he said, think about those films, those sort of military films where our sort of hero soldiers are cornered. They're going to die anyway. They're much more likely to go and attack the enemy all guns blazing because they've literally got nothing to lose. They're going to die anyway. So you might as well show some interest. So if you've got nothing, no cards left to play, then you're going to be interested. He talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays way over there on the hillside. There was that proffered temperance pledge I never signed, my grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folks and their doings, his insistence that the spheres really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. His fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. I'm going to try and remember to mute every time I blow my nose, otherwise. Right, so I think this paragraph is interesting. There's a theme all the way through Bill W.'s writings about him being, for him, it was presents an argument in We Agnostics, which effectively says it's impossible to look at the universe and say there isn't a divine intelligence that created it on purpose because he wanted to. That's Bill's argument. It's not really an argument. He sort of presents it as what he evident truth. And of course, it's not self-evident at all to most people. But there we go. That's one of the difficulties we'll come to later on if we get as far as if I don't die of this cold and we get as far as We Agnostics. But the question here for Bill is not whether God exists, but whether it's possible to have a relationship with God, and whether God can be personally interested. The other thing which is interesting here is this bloke who obviously went in very heavy on the God and spirituality side, and of course we don't do that these days. I think, what's his name, Silkworth, said to Bill, after Bill's failure for many months to actually successfully 12 step something, he said, stop talking about God. Talk about alcohol. That's the thing they know and care about. So it's remarkable to me that Ebby is obviously banging on about God, but it was absolutely the right thing for Bill. And then Bill tries to replicate that with other people and it doesn't work. And as soon as he starts talking about alcohol, things change. That wartime day in Old Winchester Cathedral came back again. I'd always believed in a power greater than myself. I'd often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are, but that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. And of course, I suppose this is another echo of the point that I was making, which is it's only strange to Bill, the idea that the world is a sort of mechanical chemistry set and has no divine purpose behind it, because he believed otherwise. But I think it's as well, I don't know what anyone's view is here, but certainly the vast majority of my sponsees, that the argument has to proceed from the other direction. And in fact, I find people very readily open to the idea that they can have a relationship with a personal higher power, but the idea that the universe has got a creative, designing, creative, intelligent, creative, anthropomorphic force behind it, people find it very difficult to swallow. And certainly these days, I find a lot of people, they're fine in their own lives, but they're troubled by the world, they're troubled by the universe, they're troubled by society, because they're precisely because of Bill's assumption being, well, their assumption is the opposite of Bill's assumption. To them, the strange proposition is that someone is literally making people go places and do good things. Essentially, that's what he's saying there. So I don't find this passage very useful with sponsees, unfortunately, because this is not their starting position, is not his starting position. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists, suggested vast laws and forces at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay all. And he's conflating two ideas here. Very obviously, there are laws operating in the universe, but there's a gap between that observation and the idea that someone sort of sat down at a desk and designed them somehow. But anyway, that's Bill's position, so we have to deal with it. How could there be so much of precise and immutable law and no intelligence? I simply had to believe in a spirit of the universe who knew neither time nor limitation, but that was as far as I got. And this is the bit where it becomes, I think, very useful with sponsees. With ministers in the world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me who was love, superhuman strength and direction, I became irritated and my mind snapped against such a theory. And I've had it this week. People, I had someone say that they believed in a higher power, but they were, I think they used the phrase raging atheist. And of course, if God is the word for the higher power, those two statements are not consistent. So there is a question which will come up later on, but we might as well do it now because we're about to come across it. There's I don't know if he's still alive. There was a Catholic, very senior Catholic in this country. For anyone on the tape, I'm not a Catholic. Who said, Cormac Murphy O'Connor, who said, I don't know anyone who believes in the God that atheists say they disbelieve in. And I'm not a great fan of Cormac Murphy O'Connor, but that I think is a great line. Most sponsees I've had object to the God they think religions are about, and certainly some more primitive corners of certain religions are about. And they almost invariably, they literally say God with a beard in the clouds, in the sky. And of course, I'm familiar with mainstream Protestantism. I'm not very familiar with Catholicism. I know a little bit about it, but nowhere in mainstream Protestantism or Catholicism does it say that God is a physical being with a beard on a cloud. That's not what any religions say, but that is the straw man argument that a lot of people have, or at least it's projected onto that. And the answer to that with sponsees is to say, look, your difficulty is not with God, your difficulty is with someone else's conceptualization. And it's very similar to if you found, if you're an anthropologist and you are in an island which was not touched by modern technological civilization, and people construed lightning to be not a sort of physical force of nature, but to be a sign of God's anger, for instance, one could quite easily reject the construal, the interpretation of what is going on. But that doesn't mean that one doesn't believe that lightning exists. It's simply one doesn't believe someone else's tale, which seeks to explain it. And this is how I separate the two with sponsees. I say, right, so you don't, I mean, I do point out the straw man argument that no one does believe that God has a beard and sits in a cloud. But then there's a problem. People have a problem with ecclesiastical structures. They have a problem with all sorts of things that they were taught in primary school about God hates you if ... No, mate, what they said they were taught about. And God dislikes this, God dislikes that. And to say those are other people's construals of that, but that doesn't mean you haven't at that point investigated the phenomenon of God itself. You haven't done anything on that. All you've done is rejected one particular interpretation or construal of that. But you're no further ahead or indeed behind in the journey of discovering what powers lie beyond the human human intelligence and willpower. That remains a project still to undertake. So to take that resentment against religion or hostility or contempt, whatever it is, and say, well, that's over there. That's got nothing to do with your interpretation, your personal interpretation of God. So that's the first big block. Because it really doesn't, I don't think it matters if one believes that God created the universe, but the bit that matters is one's, as far as AA is concerned, is one's personal relationship with the higher power. So you've got to find a way of sponsors of parking religion and all of the problems people have with that. But secondly, the second big block, and we're about to come up against it, is the idea that there is a battle between you and God as to who's going to be in charge of your life. And that's the real psychological origin of this objection. And we're coming to this right now. I became irritated. You see, he doesn't have a problem with God. He's got a problem with a personal higher power. Notice the word direction. That's your problem here. By the way, if someone wants to build up a conception of God from scratch, this phrase can be used very usefully. So you say to someone like, right, reject everything you think that the higher power is. How about you just take as a working hypothesis, what is God? God is love, superhuman strength, strength beyond your own human resources and direction. Go with that, try it for 5 years, report back on the results. It's a pretty good starting point. To Christ I conceded the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claimed him, his moral teaching most excellent. For myself, I had adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded. The wars which have been fought, the burnings and chicanery that religious dispute had facilitated made me sick. I honestly doubted whether, on balance, the religions of mankind had done any good. So again, he's got a block there with religion. As I say, the simple solution, just park that, deal with it in step 4, separate it from the question of what your personal relationship with the powers in the universe are. By the way, when someone has like no concept of a higher power, the method is this, or a method is this, and this works very well. You say, well, what is the power higher than? It's higher than my own reasoning, and more powerful than my my marshaled internal forces. And I ask a very simple question. Have you ever gone to a friend and secured advice which, when implemented, worked well in your life, them having given you an idea you couldn't have come up with yourself? Yes, good. Have you ever received encouragement from someone which enabled you to do something that you couldn't do on your own strength? Yes, good. You've now demonstrated, you now believe in a higher power. You now believe that there is wisdom out there you can access, which, if accessed and implemented, will enable you to live better. You've also just conceded that there is strength and some kind of force which enables you to do things you can't do on your own. We now believe in a higher power. The only question is how you're construing it. It doesn't need to be supernatural in flavor. In fact, and this is the other objection people have, this idea of a sort of, as they say in Molière plays, a deus ex machina. In Molière plays, what usually happens is everything goes horribly wrong and gets worse and worse and worse. And then some figure comes in from entirely outside the plot and waves a magic wand, and then everything is made right again, and all of the lovers are restored to each other, and the fathers are reconciled to the sons, and so on. So the deus ex machina is a god from outside the machine. However, a lot of traditional religious authorities suggest that God actually operates through the machine. It's not something outside the machine. The machine is part of God. So I think it's Augustine that says, or Augustine, depending on whether you're Protestant or Catholic, says that God works through nature, not against nature, which is a very good idea. So that if one's going to rely on a higher power, it doesn't need to be supernatural, because it's whatever it is in its source. Your access point is in the actual world. It's your communication with other people and with nature and with parts of your mind which you don't normally access during the course of the day. So meditation allows you to access levels of consciousness you can't normally access. Anyway, back to this. Judging from what I'd seen in Europe and since, the power of God in human affairs was negligible. The brotherhood of man a grim jest. If there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal. And this rather sort of contradicts what Bill was saying before about, God's in charge and made the universe and everything is running beautifully to plan. Now saying, well, actually, no, it's the opposite. So I'm not quite sure where he's getting his supposition that God's in charge when this is his evidence in front of him. So it's a sort of muddled old story, this one. But I think here's the key line. If there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal. And sometimes, particularly if you've got sponsees that are very upset about the world and maybe haven't studied a lot of history, aren't very well read, say, look, all you need to do is go back to 1939. You're saying the world is going to hell in a handcart now. They were saying back then as well. You go back through history, the number of writers in the 17th and the 18th centuries, it says, in our childhood, everything was wonderful, but the young generation of today are messing everything up. Everything is going downhill. This is the standard refrain of every generation. So I think it's fascinating that this is here, because there's a parallel to how a lot of people are seeing things today. But the key line is this: he certainly had me, the devil certainly had me. Once you realize you're in the grip of a power greater than yourself already, your choice is between two powers greater than yourself, alcohol or God. Pick one. There isn't a third. There isn't a third option there. I'm not the greatest fan of St. Paul, but there's some very good stuff in Romans about you're either going to be a slave to sin or a servant of God, and that matches this very clearly, right? You're trapped by the devil, and the only escape is to become a servant of God, which he's going to go on to describe. Seamus says Bill had quite a lot to drink before these theological speculations. Yes, so the William Scharberg history of the writing of the Big Book does suggest that this story is concocted after the event as a convenient myth, which collates all sorts of different bits of experience. It's not an accurate reflection of what actually happened on the day. It's a channel through which all of his ideas generally are being conveyed. Here we go, back to the text. But my friend sat before me, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. And I think this is the key to step 2. We don't need to worry about whether God is in charge of the universe. We don't need to worry about whether God created the universe. We don't need to worry about whether God intervenes in human affairs, moving people around like chess pieces. We don't need to worry about other people's conceptions of God. We don't need to worry about religions or ecclesiastical structures. What matters is that God appears to be able to do something for individuals they cannot do for themselves. That's the bit that matters. Once you can see that the program has worked for someone else, you're 95% of the way there. The only block is that you believe that you're so different that it won't work for you where it's worked for someone else. His human will had failed to moderate drinking, to stop drinking. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, the key element, he had admitted complete defeat. Then he had, in effect, been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he'd ever known. And this is the demonstration in step 2, in meetings, in 12-step calls. And I think it's important to remember this. I don't need to sell the program to sponsees. I was talking to someone the other day that's been in recovery for a long time, and they said they weren't sure whether it worked. It was going to work for them. And I said, well, you have no information that I don't have, and vice versa. There's nothing I can say to you. You've got all the evidence in front of you. When presented with that, they came back a couple of days later, and all of the objections had somehow lapsed. The evidence is in front of us. Our choice is either to believe it, people have recovered, or and not just recovered from alcohol, but have found a way to thrive, which is the important thing. Either I believe that or I don't. And the interesting thing, I hope I'm not repeating myself too much, but all you need with a problem is to find one person in AA who solved the problem, to trust that the solution exists. You don't have to have everyone solve it. You just have to have one person with a solution. The bar is very low. He's just got one person in front of him, but that's enough. Had this power originated in him, Obviously, it had not. Now, there's a contradiction here as well with what it says later on. It talks about in We Agnostics, on around page 55, I believe, this idea that God is deep down within us. And it's going to talk in the spiritual appendix too about the fact that we tap a hitherto unsuspected inner resource, which we presently identify with our higher power. Now, the hymn that it doesn't originate in, I think we can understand to be the conscious, rational mind, the bit of the mind that you actively engage to think through stuff. That's not where it's coming from. It comes from somewhere much deeper. So the job is to disengage that engine from the transmission and hook the transmission up to a deeper power source, with the intellect becoming a tool of that deeper power source, rather than running purely on what we think of as reason. Of course, it's not reason, because a drink seems to me like a good idea on occasion. That's the whole point. The reasoning faculty has got a fundamental bug in it, a ghost in the machine. Had this power originated in him? Obviously, it had not. There was no more power in him than there was in me at that minute, and this was none at all. And when we're talking about power, this is the power to stop drinking, to stay stopped, before we even get to anything else. That floored me. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. Here was something at work in a human heart which had done the impossible. My ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Never mind the musty past. Here sat a miracle directly across the kitchen table. He shouted great tidings. It's a cold, not COVID, by the way. Before you rush to put all of your masks on. Is there anything to say about this? Yes, the miracle is a banal miracle. The miracles of AA are banal miracles. The miracle of being able to walk down the drinks aisle of Sainsbury's and not buy a bottle of booze. The miracle of being able to get up for work and go to work and just do your job and keep your mouth largely shut. That's enough of a miracle. You crack both of those in your first 10 years, you're doing pretty well. Let me tell you, I didn't crack the second one in the first 10 years, not consistently. So the miracles are banal miracles. We're not looking for anything supernatural here. We're looking for people who are unable to do ordinary things, learning how to do ordinary things. I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. He was on a different footing. His roots grasped a new soil. And I think this is a very important idea of the program. I'm going to be controversial and I'm going to be offensive. So if you are the delicate disposition, and please, can you avert your ears? I know you can avert your eyes. I'm not sure the ears can be averted in the same way. There is a phenomenon in the world of recovery which I might refer to as fellowship shopping, where one has sort of half a dozen different problems and one takes one's little tray in the recovery canteen to all sorts of different counters of different fellowships, and you take what you want and you leave the rest, and you assemble your little program combining the bottom lines here and the middle lines from there and the top lines from there, and your little pair of silver scales to weigh your broccoli, and your set of how to, your boundary measures, how to set boundaries. In Al-Anon, you go around setting boundaries to people, telling them what to do and getting very upset when they won't respect them, and going to meetings and complaining about how no one will respect your boundaries. And so you've got what looks like a very good program. You've got all the tools, but there's a big difference in my experience between staying in charge yourself and collecting tools of recovery, tools of spirituality, tools of the program in order to manage your material life better so that you can achieve the things that you want to achieve in the world, so that when you've achieved them, you're going to be happy. There's a big difference between that and saying, oh, I don't care. I'm just going to do the next right thing and let the chips fall as they may. Completely different approach. There's a big difference between all this very intense soul searching and endless inventories and endless meetings and endless sets of, because I've done the steps in 18 different fellowships. There's a world of difference between that and my friend Sel in San Antonio saying, I'm just another bozo on the bus. That's his message. I'm just another bozo on the bus. This is about I think this is about letting go completely and just quietly serving the higher power. And the first 9 steps are there to get my other self out of the way, to get me not to rearrange and reorganize myself, but to get me to rear back in horror and say, I'm disgusted. I don't want anything to do with how I've been living. I don't want any of it. Give me a completely new way to live. It's much simpler and it's much quicker. Those are the other advantages, and it works. Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. If you'll permit me, I'm going to do a digression into the Course in Miracles. Now, one of the key ideas in the Course in Miracles is that there's an argument between you and God over who created you. Imagine being at a concert where you're just part of the crowd, you're just loving it, you're not thinking about yourself, you're just completely absorbed in the music, you're connected to the performers, you feel personally connected to the performers, you feel personally connected to the other people in the audience, having a wonderful time. And then a little thought comes in, and the thought says, why aren't you on stage with everyone looking at you? And this is the serpent in the garden, to use another story. The temptation is wanting to be special. So you go to God and you say, I don't want this unity business. I don't want to be dissolved into the universe as just one part of the universe. I want you to love me specially. I want you to love me. I want to be a little bit more special to you than to everyone else. So can you give me just a tiny little bit of specialness? And God says, well, I can't really, because to make you special, I have to make other people less special. I'd have to withdraw my love from other people to make my love for you special. It's turning it into a zero-sum game. And so God says, no, I'm afraid. I mean, it's ridiculous. You've got the love of the entire universe, and you want to exchange that for a fragment of love, which you think will be more, your little bit of specialness will be better than being a child of the entire universe. And at this point, you could say, oh, you're right. I'm so sorry, my mistake. But no. This is the idea in A Course in Miracles. What we did was we said, well, F you then. I'll show you. I will make myself, I'm going to make something of myself. And in denying God's authorship, just like when in little children, when the mother goes out of the room, the kid thinks the parent has literally been destroyed and that they've destroyed the parent somehow. The price of specialness is guilt, the shame that one's done something wrong, the guilt for having done it, and the fear of retribution. So you escape in the world, in the material world, trying to create a material existence which gives you a little bit of immortality right here, right now, because you know you're toast in a few decades anyway. And hopefully God won't be able to find you here. If you're a body, you can't go, your ego does not want you to go back and choose God again in that metaphysical space, that connection with the higher power. The ego doesn't want that. So it's got to convince you that you are your body, that you are your identity in the material world. You are the the job you've got, the ethnicity, the sex, the sexual orientation, the politics, the social status, the possessions, the achievements, the skills, the flaws. And so this is a kind of a pretty universal antipathy towards God, because that's where the problem started. This idea that God is out to get for something that is fundamentally wrong with you. And I certainly was like this. He says, I've talked with scores of men who felt the same way. It's exactly how I felt. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? So this is about setting aside all of the old ideas, including anything that the ego has come up with, and saying instead, I'm going to start again. I'm going to start from scratch with a blank sheet of paper and then see where it takes me. That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. And so the deal is this. If you want the release from alcohol, you've got to have a relationship with God. And the relationship with God is one of simple practical servant in the material world. It's no more complicated. It's no more theological than that. So that one doesn't have to worry about theological conceptions at all. One doesn't need to worry about the ego's fears, this sense of that God presents a threat. Start somewhere else and build it up from nothing. Thus was I convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. At long last, I saw, I felt, I believed. Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. A new world came into view. The real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst upon me. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. There had been humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. But soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by worldly clamours, mostly those within myself. And so it had been ever since, how blind I had been. My experience with the first 9 steps, particularly steps 4 through 9, is their purpose is to get rid of the worldly clamours. And those, I think, come in 2 forms. There's all of the obsessive resentment and anxiety and guilt and shame associated with material existence. And secondly, behind that, there's the ego's game plan for specialness, how I'm going to wrest with the W, wrest specialness from the world. And that's a never-ending treadmill. So the purpose of the first 9 steps is to deactivate that treadmill. And then I think it's well said that the program is a program of subtraction. You subtract everything which is untrue, and then you're left with what is true. You subtract everything which has been conjured out of nothing to replace God. As soon as it's cast out of the way, God just shows up automatically. And this is a line they get from the Book of James. So at one point, one of the names that was considered for AA was the James Society. The Book of James was used a lot by the Oxford groups. And it's the idea, if you go a little way towards God, God will come all of the rest of the way towards you. So you don't have to go a long way into abstract realms. Just a little bit of work in the material plane will enable God to show up. At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. This is interesting. I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Every single slipper I've ever sponsored, with almost no exception, there's one type of exception, believes that if they slip, they can come back on their own, and that they can choose to stop the slip whenever they want to stop the slip and then put that into practice. I think this is very interesting. I was separated from alcohol for the last time. It seems as though he couldn't have done it himself. And I think that's, I don't know how intentional that was, but I think that's a really important line. It conveys the truth for me. I remember saying to Doug in 1993, I think I've really given up alcohol now. And he said, Princess, you haven't given up alcohol, it's given up you. And I instinctively knew that was correct, and it frightened. Because if it was choosing, this is the Tom W thing. Alcoholism is like dancing with the gorilla. You're not done dancing until the gorilla is done dancing. And now we get the steps. I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. And what this is going to mean is quite literally, what I do today should be guided by God, not me. The literal, actual actions I take in my life. God is not helping me to live my life. I've given up my life. I've given it to God and say, oh, you do something with it. Just give me instructions to carry out today. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. Those two are important. That pairing, I can trust the direction because it's going to be in my best interests. Sometimes people are frightened. If I do God's will, I'm going to have to do something horrible, which will not be in my best interests. I think it's axiomatic that God's will is what is in my best interests, whether I can see it at the time or not. Whether I can see it is an entirely different question, but it will be in my best interests. That's what makes it God's will. It's the best of the available options in the given circumstances. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. The image which I've heard used for this is that we're like light bulbs. Unless we're placed in the right chain of, as it were, fairy lights, there's no way we can light ourselves up. And everything that we do in the ego world is an attempt to light ourselves up rather than finding the place in the chain of fairy lights that we belong. So this is, people sometimes object to this thinking, oh, does this mean I'm worthless as a person? No, it means that it's like a jigsaw puzzle piece. If it's lost under the sofa, it isn't doing anyone any good. There's nothing wrong with the piece, it's in the wrong place. So this is not a recipe for low self-worth, it's a recipe for high self-worth, which is that you have a vital role to play. You need to find what the role is and play it. Without him, I was lost, like the jigsaw puzzle piece. I ruthlessly faced my sins, step 6, and became willing to have my newfound friend take me away root and branch. I've not had a drink since, step 7. Root and branch. The fundamental question with step 7, yes, God is removing the defect, but it's not without our cooperation and work. And the images, but I find very helpful. The branches is that's the bit you can see. The root is the bit you can't see. So if I do the work on the branches, the roots will take care of themselves. And this has been my experience, that if I say no enough to a resentful thought, the resentful thought eventually just stops coming. I can't do anything consciously to stop my mind producing resentful thoughts, but what I can do when they come up is reject them, quietly move and redirect my mind to something else. Does that make sense? That there's a bit that I can do, there's a bit that I can't do. There's the branch is the bit I can see, I can do something about. The root is the bit that I can't. My schoolmate visited me and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. Step 5, we made a list of people I'd hurt or towards whom I felt resentment at steps 4 and 8. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals admitting my wrong. Now there's a little problem with this bit, which is that in some schools of AA, when you do your step 4, and people, they get it from this passage, which is why it's so dangerous. You make a list in step 8 of all the people you've harmed and all the people you've resented, and you go around to all the people that you've resented and you say, hello, I've secretly been resenting you for the last 7 years, but now I've forgiven you. Can we be friends? And of course, this does not help. I've had people do that to me. I did not want to know. I was not grateful for learning this. I think the principle is that something has to be done about those relationships, but whether or not one has to candidly admit a secret grudge or grievance is another question. It gets much clearer when you look at step 9, except when to do so would injure them or others is the clause which corrects that. Never, and so these lines must not be taken out, first of all, out of context, and secondly, out of the far bigger context of the rest of the book. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to write, well, that's going to free up the whole day. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability. And so sometimes there are people that, hard as it is maybe for you to believe, that I've had a real beef with in AA. And what I've done is made an effort basically to make friends with them, but without telling them that I had the resentment in the first place. So I can sit next to anyone. If there's one chair in the room and it's next to the one person I like the least, I'm not bothered by sitting. I'm happy to sit next to them, talk to them, ask them how their week was. I don't like bad relations with anyone. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. So a thought comes into your mind, ask God what God thinks. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense. I think that's just Bill playing with words. I've tried to make conscious sense of that line for the last 28 years, and I have consistently failed. I think what he means is he's raising common sense to a higher level. He's adding an extra layer of reliability to it. I wouldn't try to define uncommon sense more profoundly than that. I was to sit quietly when in doubt, bottom of page 87, when agitated or doubtful, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. And this is very interesting. The two commodities we get from God are always these two. This pairing occurs all the way through the book. The satellite navigation system telling me where to go, and the strength is the petrol and the engine enabling me to drive there. And so this is why it's okay to set aside all the theological stuff. What matters is this: to meet my problems as he would have me. Literally, what does God want me to do today? Give me the strength to do the things that God wants me to do today. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my requests for my usefulness for others. This is echoed on page 87. Then only might I expect to receive, but that will be in great measure. My friend promised that when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my creator. Mark Houston makes a lot of this, and I think there's truth to it. The first 9 steps have to be completed. There's a huge difference between having one amend that you could make but haven't, and having no amends to make. There's a world of difference. The marginal effect of making the last amend is greater than the marginal effect of making all of the other amends put together in my experience. It's because what it does, dropping the last grudge, making the last amend, communicating the last secret, what it does is it gets rid of the material world justification for the inner sense that there is something wrong with me. Now, that inner sense that there is something wrong with me does not come from the things I've done in the world. It comes from my notion that I'm going to set myself up and make myself a person, as opposed to recognizing myself as a sort of an extension of God. So if God is the sun, we're the rays. If God is the dancer, we're the dance, or possibly the danced. The sense of there being something wrong with me comes from being considering oneself to be separate, like the jigsaw puzzle piece under the sofa, trying to wonder what its place in the world is, and feeling awkward and out of place and missing something. Once there was no one left that I was holding a grievance against consciously. I mean, things, come up during the course of the day, but I mean, people that there was no one on my grudge list. There were no secrets, there were no unfinished amends. I realized the fundamental truth, there was nothing wrong with me. And that whole story that I was separate from God, that there was something wrong with me, was a lie. But it took the last amend to achieve that. That I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems. I'd say that is twofold. Almost every practical situation has turned out brilliantly. Not every practical situation has turned out brilliantly, but my emotional experience of those situations can always eventually turn out brilliantly. That's why it's all my problems. So God is not going to find me all the parking spaces or make every project work out. That's not the point. The problem is my disturbance at the situation, not the situation itself. Belief in the power of God plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things for the essential requirements. Honesty, what's the honesty? Page 58, it talks about honesty. I have a problem, I don't have a solution. That's honesty and humility. I have a problem, I don't have a solution. Willingness, give me a solution, I'll implement it without arguing with it. Simple but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. In the St. Augustine prayer book, it defines pride as the putting of self in the place of God as the center and main objective of my life. And and therefore you infer humility is having God in the place of self as the center and main objective of my life. So it's fundamentally construing one's position in one's own life to be quite different. I'm not the center of it. I'm the agent who is doing stuff in this life of mine, the life that is not mine, which is assigned to me for the principle, which is the higher power. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity as I had never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. Now, there's a very important principle here. The moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. Now, my observation is when people say, oh, sod it, I'm going to just accept the AA program, just do what I'm told. They relax. The phone calls with sponsees who are surrendered, even if they're like 2 days sober, 5 days sober, completely relaxed. There's a buoyancy about them. That's where the surrender happens. It gets formalized in step 3, but it happens a lot earlier. When the calls with sponsees are tense, it's because this hasn't happened. There's a resistance at an earlier stage. And this is why I believe we stay sober all the way through the first 11 steps until we're in the step 12, which is where we apparently have the spiritual awakening. This is the grace that's given us as a free pass to get us through the steps. For a moment, I was alarmed and called my friend, the doctor, to ask if I was still sane. He listened in wonder as I talked. Finally, he shook his head, saying, "Something has happened to you I don't understand, but you had better hang on to it. Anything is better than the way you were." The good doctor now sees many men who have had such experiences. He knows that they are real. While I lay in the hospital, the thought came that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They in turn might work with others. You can tell your sponsee who is 18 minutes sober has surrendered because they suddenly realize there are other human beings in the room and they want to help the person that's 17 minutes sober. When your sponsee starts spontaneously talking about how to help someone they've spotted who's in trouble, you know this has worked. William James talks about in the varieties of religious experience, which I have not read, but I've heard excerpts read out. I can't get through it. But one of the ideas in it is the hallmark of a true spiritual experience is a desire to help others. You may or may not get an altered emotional state, but you will want to help others. That will become the chief focus of your life. Tell that to the people on the retreats. Anyway, outside issue. My friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating, you know what I mean, James. My friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. Particularly was it imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. Faith without works was dead, he said, and how appallingly true for an alcoholic. For if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. It's going to be rough. So surrender means accepting you're going to have rough periods. You may have a rough few years, but you'll survive if you perfect and enlarge your spiritual life. Now, the curious thing is their notion of perfecting and enlarging spiritual life is not candles and peace and tranquility and cushions. It's going and doing things for other people. It's there are other approaches to spirituality. You can go and meditate for 15 hours a day. It's a different path. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. The spiritual life they're talking about all the way through the book is one where you set yourself aside and you find a way to be useful in the world. My wife and I abandoned ourselves with enthusiasm to the idea of helping other alcoholics to a solution to their problem. Alistair, if I can go a couple of minutes over, I'm going to try and finish the chapter. May I do that? Okay. My sponsor says, if you're abandoning ship, if any part of your body remains on the ship, all of you is going to go down with the ship. You've got to leave the ship completely. My wife and I abandoned ourselves with enthusiasm to the idea of helping other alcoholics to a solution to their problems. It was fortunate for my old business associates remained skeptical for a year and a half, during which I found little work. I was not too well at the time and was plagued by waves of self-pity and resentment. Interestingly, Jim, who slips, people make a great play about Jim on page 35. Is it 35? I think it's 35. Who's got a tiny little resentment with his boss, and he's like, aha, that's why Jim slipped. It doesn't add up. If Jim slips because of resentment, why doesn't Bill slip here? It's not the resentment. Fred has no resentment on page 39 and yet slips on page 41. Bill is full of resentment but doesn't slip. It's not about altering an emotional state. If your emotions are altered as a result of this, lucky you, good for you. But it's about survival by abandonment of self. And then over time, the promises come. Also, this means you don't have to be well to help others. You don't have to be like, he was plagued by waves of self-pity and resentment. He didn't work on himself first. He went and helped others first, and then look what happens. This sometimes nearly drove me back to drink, but I soon found that when all other measures failed, in other words, inventory will fail, talking to your pals will fail, step 11 will fail, prayer and meditation will fail. Work with another alcoholic would save the day. Many times I've gone to my old hospital in despair. On talking to a man there, I would be amazingly lifted up and set on my feet. It is a design for living that works in rough going. Almost every emotional problem I've had in the last 28 years has been solved not by analysis or comprehension, but by diverting my attention, coming back and realizing that the shit show that I built up out of nothing. It's not come through intellectual understanding. There's a little bit of picking apart that happens in step 4, but basically the emotional release comes from separating myself from it. And then when I come back to it, I come back from a higher level, then I can see it for what it is. A city looks different when you're in the street than if you're in a helicopter above. And that's the point. It puts you in the helicopter and then you say, aha, now I can see what's going on. We commenced to make many fast friends, and the fellowship has grown up among us, of which it is a wonderful thing to feel a part. The joy of living we really have, even under pressure and difficulty. Again, it's not going to be a bed of roses. I have seen hundreds of families set their feet on the path that really goes somewhere, have seen the most impossible domestic situations righted, feuds and bitternesses of all sorts wiped out. I have seen men come out of asylums and resume a vital place in the lives of their families and communities. Business and professional men have regained their standing. There is scarcely any form of trouble and misery which has not been overcome among us. In one Western city and its environs, there are 1,000 of us and our families. We meet frequently, so that lots of meetings, so that newcomers may find the fellowship they seek. At these informal gatherings, one may often see from 50 to 200 persons. We're growing in numbers and power. An alcoholic in his cups is an unlovely creature. Our struggles with them are variously strenuous, comic, and tragic. One poor chap committed suicide in my home. He could not or would not see our way of life. There is, however, a vast amount of fun about it all. I suppose some would be shocked at our seeming worldliness and levity, but just underneath there is deadly earnestness. Faith has to work 24 hours a day in and through us or we perish. Very important line. This idea that the program is not something I do here and there. It's not the decoration. It's not little pit stops. It is the basis. It's the method by which I live. Totally different concept. Most of us feel we need look no further for utopia. Apparently that was originally heaven, but it was changed to utopia because some of the Catholic priests that saw it objected. We have it with us right here and now. Each day, my friend's simple talk in our kitchen multiplies itself in a widening circle of peace on earth and goodwill to men. And so I think this is the idea that recovery is a single fire which is continuously propagating. And my job in recovery is to find dead wood to light up. That's all I've got, Alistair. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. That does seem an appropriate place to stop, and we'll begin next week on the next chapter. There is the solution, and I've dropped a link into for the recordings, and the recordings of tonight's meeting will be available in the next couple of days. The previous ones are there, and with that, I'll hand back to Tim. If you could take us out with the Serenity Prayer, please.
Thanks. Closing with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity
to
accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Thanks, Tim.
See you next week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.